Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss American Pilgrimage, a historical journey through Catholic life in a new world. There are three parts of this book: seeds, fruits, and seasons, where the seeds are the origin, the beginnings of New Spain, New France, New England. Now, fruits is mainly 19th century, but moving into the 20th, about the growth of the Catholic Church and its relationship with other members of the American society. And we all discussed parishes, which were very important in the growth of the church, as they should have been. Now comes the chapter on walls, that is, signs of division, of opposition, between Catholics and others in America. And I must say that even at my advanced age, I still kind of think of my growing up as what was normal, what was the world was like. This is what the world is like. But I didn't really feel or experience this century long of hostility of the Catholics that really affected everything. But that was when my father changed his name. His name was Fessio, F-A-S-S-I-O. In the 20s, he changed it to Fessio because he thought that sounded less Italian. I don't know if that's true or not, but to go to that effort to change a vowel in your name because of the hostility around you, that shows that there is hostility, What do you do with a name like Bacigalupi? I don't know how you fix that one. All right, so let's go into the walls. I hear nothing.
Well,
I know you're two things at once. Okay.
Well, I was just going to say that I did not realize how extensive and intense the anti-Catholicism was. And it was tied up also with the anti-immigration of people coming from non-Anglo-Saxon backgrounds. And although I didn't know how severe it was until I read this book, I had an inkling of it because I grew up in a WASP family, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, although they were more atheists and freethinkers and Freemasons than Protestants. But the point is that I knew from that upbringing just how fierce the hatred of Catholics was, because it was one of the things that made me curious about the church. Because I was such a rebel. It was like, gosh, why do you and then when I realized everybody hated the Catholics, the Protestants, the atheists, the Masons, the communists, it's like, wow, the Catholic Church must have something going on.
Actually, I was similar. I mean, I want to be very brief on this because we're talking about America and this is England, but I was also raised very anti-Catholic. And it did make the Catholic Church something which was mysterious and, should we say, formidable, right? If everybody hates it, then what is it about it, right? So I remember going to the Catholic Church the first time when I was about 8 or 9 years old and just feeling a presence there which was just absent in all the other Anglican churches I've been to. And so, it can backfire, I think.
Right. Well, and then there also is the element of the church. One of the big fears among the Anglo-Saxon Americans was that somehow Rome, vis-a-vis the Pope, was going to exercise some kind of control over American life or American politics or something. And we can look at that as being an irrational kind of fear, but that when you look at some of the reasons of this, it wasn't entirely irrational. I mean, why didn't the church just come out and say, of course you could be Catholic and American at the same time?
Well, yes, there was this sense of, why didn't the Catholic Church simply say that you could have American democracy and Roman Catholic religion as compatible, ways of life. But we have to remember in the 19th century, and at the end of the 18th, you had Catholic countries. Well, England was already Protestant, but where the revolutions took place and Catholics were persecuted in the name of reason, and enlightenment and progress. And so Rome, in the through the popes, reacted very strongly to that. And so they were very loath to make some statement that, okay, democracy is okay, because they saw that as religious indifference. Oh, you can have your own religion, So that was one reason why I believe that the popes were slow. And this book is going to go into that more. That was Testem Benevolentia, of Leo the 13th, slow to recognize a separation of church and state, a role, a semi-autonomous role for civil society apart from the church. Yeah, so it took time for that to happen.
And the other thing as well, of course, is that these WASPs, these Anglo-Saxon Protestants, are steeped in the propaganda wars of the English Reformation. And one of the things that the Puritans and the Protestants leveled against the Catholics is that you owe your allegiance to the Pope, right? And that was part of that, the rise of English nationalism, which is started to sort of come in at the time of Queen Elizabeth I. So this goes right back, and of course these people were from that stock, right, with those prejudices. So they're just replaying, like a stuck record, the knee-jerk anti-Catholicism of 2 centuries previously.
And the role of propaganda that you mentioned, I mean, these salacious novels and fictions being passed off as true about life in the convents. I remember coming across these tracts that still are being distributed in Protestant circles to this day about the nuns and the monks, all the hanky and.
Yeah, what I found very interesting, because I only knew about Maria Monk sort of, from reading secondhand, but here, now of course I still haven't read it, I don't intend to, but what I found very interesting, bottom of page 288, Maria Monk's, so that's a pseudonym, of course, awful disclosure of the Hotel Dieu nunnery. Monk's book sold roughly 300,000 copies, second only to Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, among best-selling novels prior to the Civil War. And again, this was all a hoax that was exposed. And she died. She was arrested. She became an alcoholic, was arrested for pickpocketing in a New York brothel, and died in prison. So this is the disreputable character who wrote this under the name of Maria Monk. But I just astonished, the second best-selling novel or book, because it was being passed off as non-fiction, prior to antebellum America. I mean, that's 300,000 copies. I mean, and part of it's obviously the anti-Catholicism, the other, salaciousness sells. And so you put the two together, right? Anti-Catholic bigotry and a little bit of sexy spice, then you've got a winner.
Well, the term probably didn't exist at the time, but we now call it confirmation bias. When you have something to read or available that confirms your own judgments or views or even prejudices, well, then, of course, you want to read it.
Right.
It's happening today. In fact, one of the problems today is that there's so many different sources of information you have that we all tend to go to the ones that we agree with. And I think it causes greater polarization. However, this book makes it clear that polarization is nothing new.
Right.
That it's been deeply embedded in the whole history of our country. Right. On that same page, Joseph, I mean, this has to do with the resistance of Catholics to the violence and the riots, against these convents. Page 280 at the top, when the convent was threatened, Sister Edmund refused and threatened, disperse immediately, for if you don't, the bishop has 20,000 Irishmen at his command in Boston, They will whip you all into the sea. And then that was Boston. On page 295, we have Bishop Dagger John Hughes, when again they threatened the churches, 5 lines down. If a single Catholic church was burned in New York, the city would become a second Moscow. Now he's writing this in the 1830s, so of course this is not too long after Napoleon burned down Moscow, and the whole city was burned.
And that convent that Mother Superior tried to protect was in fact burned down. And so the Archbishop of New York had as a ready example of what these people were capable of doing.
Yes.
And so he took a tough line, and it worked in his case because the church was not harmed. So yes, this did come to real violence. One of the things he doesn't mention, except in passing a few times, is how ubiquitous Freemasonry was in America at this time. And when you come out west to these old Western towns, every single town has a lodge, a Freemasonry lodge. And he does mention the know-nothings on page 290, the Native American Association, not the Indians people. This is the nativist people who consider them Americans. And when asked about their secret organization, they were supposed to say, "I know nothing," which is how they got nicknamed the Know-Nothings. I always wondered about that. I had heard of the Know-Nothings, and I didn't realize that this was the background of that.
Now, what about the Masons? In the sense, in Europe, for sure. I mean, in our time, in my time, our time together here, I see Masonic lodges kind of like the Lions Club and the Elks Club. They're sort of fraternal organizations. Whereas apparently still in Europe, they seem to be secret organizations that are hostile to Christianity, especially the Catholic Church.
Well, all Masons, whether European or North American, are hostile to the Catholic Church. What happened in North America, different from Europe, where they remain very atheistic, is that they did have some kind of a marriage between the mainline Protestant churches here and the lodges. So, for example, in downtown San Francisco, the Episcopal Cathedral and the Masonic Lodge are right next to each other. That's not an accident. So, however, even the Freemasons here are very anti-Catholic.
Yeah, I mean, the Masonic lodges in the English-speaking world are derived from the Scottish Masonic lodges. They were very anti-Catholic, but the European lodges were actually revolutionary.
Yes, and anti-Christian.
They were actually part of the anti-Catholic revolutions across Europe, and it was the response to those European Masons rather than the Scottish branch of Freemasonry that the Catholic Church condemned Freemasonry. Not that it should not condemn the Scottish variety, but I think there is a difference. Scottish variety was always somewhat milder in terms of these revolutionary atheistic agendas. And that's why I think what happened to the Freemasons in the United States is what happened to Catholics in the United States. They became bourgeois, and so they basically they've softened their secularism and they've accommodated Christianity. I mean, I'm in the Bible Belt here. This is a Southern Baptist country. You go to tiny towns where everyone's going to Southern Baptist church and are also members of the lodge. I mean, it just isn't true that those lodges are havens of atheism. They might still be havens of anti-Catholicism, but it's a sort of Protestant fundamentalist anti-Catholicism, not an atheistic one.
Right, and the anti-Catholicism does stem back to the political involvement of the church in Europe. So there is a place when you go up the ranks of Freemasonry, you crush the papal tiara with your foot. And, they are about bringing about Republican forms of government as if that were against whatever the Catholic Church's role in politics might have been. And so, and you can see that seeping into these arguments that go on for a century in American life and actually still go on, that somehow there's this secret agenda of the Pope to control American life. Even when JFK is running for the presidency, he has to somehow persuade people not to fall for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not sure the Pope can run the Catholic Church. but I'm not, I
Right.
don't know what the fear is, but
But I mean, the point is, that it is true, of course, that the Catholic Church is the only virtuous form of globalism, right? It is universal, and therefore it is going to balk. It's going to the radical nationalists that idolize the state, the nation state as the ultimate good, are going to have problems with people who refuse to do that because they say there's an ultimate God beyond the nation state. So there's always going to be an issue, and it is a tension, and it's an understandable one, and it's a real one, and it's a healthy one, because it means that Catholics are always actually a counterbalance against this radical nationalist patriotism, which is always a tendency amongst peoples. The Catholic Church actually is a moderating influence.
Yes. The other interesting role played here by the arguments over the schools.
yes,
Nothing new there. And the ironic outcome of, the Protestants want Bible reading in the schools, but of course it will be the King James Bible. The Catholics don't want their students reading the King James Bible. Unfortunately, one of the outcomes of this argument was, fine, we won't have any Bible. I mean, it actually led to an even more ardent secularization of public education in this country when they got rid of the Bible entirely. And, well, we know the result of what happens when there's no faith and morals taught to children in any kind of earnest way.
On page 296 on this, I mean, we're talking about this is 1841 elections, 1850. So 180 years ago, Bishop Hughes of New York, he redirects his energies towards the development of a separate Catholic school system, because the public school system, we just said, has become very secular, very secularist even. But then we have this problem, which has not changed at all. This solution to the problem meant that Catholics will be forced to pay twice for education. Taxes to support the public school system, donations to support the Catholic school system. Catholics committed to a separate education system still suffer under this burden.
Yes.
So we're being forced to pay for a public school system we're not using and don't agree with.
Let's be clear, that the problem here was not that the schools were secular, but that they were Protestant. The public schools were teaching the Protestant faith and reading the Protestant Bible. That's why the Catholics didn't want their children going there.
But as you've already said, that the consequence of this was a de facto secularism.
Yeah, almost 100 years later.
If we're going to have arguments about religion, let's just keep religion out of it. That was what was happening, right?
But that comes much later. Right now, the argument is over. No, we don't want our children reading the wrong Bible. Gosh, at least they are reading the Bible now, and we can look at it,
Yes, but Bishop Dagger John Hughes was, I'm not exactly sure what his dates are, but he says on page 296, bottom of that first paragraph, Hughes judged the secularism proposed by the current educational authorities as akin to an established church, and insisted forcing Catholics to fund such schools violated the American principle of freedom of conscience. So whenever Hughes was, he saw the public school system as imposing secularism.
Interesting, because the fight started over this Bible reading, but maybe it already segued already in the
it says here, middle of the page.
Also, because on 295, it says Hughes adopted a moderate conciliary tone, making in effect an argument for an interdenominational Christianity as the basis for a common morality, a kind of civil religion. The exclusion of Christianity allowed for the imposition of a new sectarianism on all citizens at the public expense. So this must have been a three-way fight going on. You had the Protestants wanting their Protestant faith in the schools, the Catholics wanting schools that taught the Catholic faith, and then this other force trying to just secularize education. And unfortunately, the secularists won.
Yeah. And that's what, but in the middle of page 296, he says, he, that is Hughes, then redirected his energies to the development of a separate Catholic school system by 1850, So it's middle of the 19th century, this transition takes place where I think earlier on, you're right, it was Catholics not wanting to have the King James Bible. And then that began to to morph into Catholics not wanting to have an established secularism in the schools.
Right.
Yeah, what I found very interesting, and this parallels almost exactly with what was happening in England following Catholic emancipation with the growth of the Catholic school system. And in my book, Faith of Our Fathers, I give the statistics in late Victorian England of the increase in the number of Catholic schools. But Christopher Shannon does the same here at the top of page 297. In 1850, Pennsylvania had 14 parochial schools serving a few hundred students. By 1880, 30 years later, they had 169 schools serving more than 40,000 students. New York saw similar growth during this period, from 17 schools and a little more than 9,000 students to 209 schools and more than 76,000 students. And what we're actually seeing here in those stats, I mean, is that this is the preservation, the conservation of the Catholic faith. If these initiatives hadn't been taken and all the Catholics had gone to the public school system, right, then we would not have the re-energized Catholicism, which we saw at the end of the 19th century, both in England and in the United States, and into the 20th century, that Catholic revival. It's initiatives such as this and how crucial they were that prevented the Catholic faith sort of just being subsumed within the broader secularized culture.
And yet most children then, as well as now, most Catholic children go to public schools. Even with this amazing growth in the number of Catholic schools being founded, still the majority of Catholic children went then to public schools as they do now. And so the thing that really astonished me here was that these schools were staffed mostly by lay people. This was before the surge of women religious teachers that comes later. And that is just astonishing because, of course, they were underpaid, mostly lay women. As the school system expanded and costs rose, this is 297, however, religious sisters who lived under a vow of poverty replaced the lay teachers.
But are you certain of that, Vivian, that at this time, let's say 1860 or 1870, there were more Catholic children in public schools than Catholic schools? It may be true, but
Well, here he says...
Where's here?
Here on page 298, in the bottom of the second paragraph, he goes, throughout the Northeast, only about 30% of parishes had schools. Most Catholic children did not and never would attend the parochial schools that remain such iconic emblems of the urban parish in its glory days.
Yeah, but I would say that if I remember correctly from reading this, that's because the Northeast were failing to do what was being done in Philadelphia, New York, and in parts of the Midwest.
No, Philadelphia is considered the Northeast.
Well, no, not in what he's talking about here. Those figures, Pennsylvania and New York. He's talking about Boston and further north here. If you actually look at it, Boston lagged behind cities such as New York and Philadelphia.
I see what you're saying. Yes.
So it's New England which is not doing what New York and Philadelphia and other parts of the United States are doing.
I see your point there. I suspect, though, that the rest of the country never did catch up with those places in terms of the density of Catholic schools.
Well, yeah. I want to point out something. It's a factoid on page 316. I didn't realize this. 2/3 down the page. This is after World War I. The Senate failed to ratify the vindictive Treaty of Versailles. I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either.
I mean, because that's what brought out World War II.
That's right.
And I remember that the Catholic, it was a Catholic ambassador to Moscow, I think, from China, who eventually became he became a Catholic while he was in Europe, became a monk actually, but he actually left the discussion because he said he could not participate in this vindictive treaty that was certainly to cause a war in a short period of time, which it did.
Yeah, that was pointing that out because I didn't actually highlight that, and that is very, very important, and it's certainly, how should we say, a feather in the cap of the United States, because obviously the Treaty of Versailles was a disaster which laid the foundations for the following war.
And they also refused to join the League of Nations, which was the brainchild of their own president, President Wilson.
Yes, yeah.
Right. And he has a few things to say about Woodrow Wilson later as well. But going back one page to 315 here, I didn't know this about the Knights of Columbus. I mean, their very important role in American history, not just Catholic history, but American history. So 3 lines down on 315, the Knights lobbied Congress to mandate the construction of a Columbus Memorial in Washington, D.C. The memorial was completed and unveiled on June the 8th, 1912. At the same time, the Knights had been lobbying the establishment of Columbus Day, October the 12th, as a national holiday. The campaign began at the state level in Colorado. By 1912, 30 states had adopted the holiday. I had no idea the Knights of Columbus were behind Columbus Day. I mean, there's so many gems of maybe both of you knew that. Maybe that's general knowledge, but it was completely new to me.
I didn't know that either. Of course, now Columbus Day and the Columbus statue have been torn down.
Yeah.
And the reason for it was to try to find a unifying figure that came from a Catholic background.
Yes.
And
exactly.
now it's back to being a divisive figure. Oh boy. Anyway, just goes round and round.
The thing that I, especially with my background, the thing I found very intriguing as well was the history of the Ku Klux Klan. I knew something about it. Obviously, I knew it arose originally after the Civil War, but they had this great revival in the 1920s. I was aware of that as well, and the irony in the 1920s is it moved from the South into the Midwest, and was actually its heartland was Illinois and Indiana and what have you. But what I didn't realize here, and I suppose it makes sense because I did see this film years ago, D.W. Griffith's epic film, The Birth of a Nation, was the springboard for the reinvigoration, the resurrection, if you like, the Ku Klux Klan. And I remember seeing that, and the Ku Klux Klan come in all their hoods like the 7th Cavalry, to save the day. I mean, it really is in your face. But then this, again, in 1925, the Klan organized a 40,000-man parade down Pennsylvania Avenue. 40,000. I mean, it's just astonishing. And then they joined this coalition of other secret societies, the Masons, the Knights of Pythias, the Loyal Orange Lodges, of which I was a member, anti-Catholic secret society, and the Federation of Patriotic Societies, this should we say, unholy alliance of secret societies against the Catholic Church. And then there's this wonderful book, not wonderful, but anti-Catholic book, published at the bottom of page 317, The Ku Klux Klan or the Knights of Columbus Klan. That's the battle lines being drawn. Of course, this is an anti-Catholic book, so they're pro KKK, not KFC. But again, the fact that the Knights of Columbus were, if you like, the knights in shining armor that were fighting the KKK was something I had no idea about at all.
They were probably doing, and didn't we see this in the Saints and Sinners of the Cristero War, the pivotal role of the Knights of Columbus?
Yes, we did.
That they played a role in defending the faith and Catholics bigger than any other group, including the church herself, because they were more organized than the church at that point.
Christopher Shannon does mention that later as well. But it's another wonderful line here, but just to conclude the Klan thing, on 318, when he says that in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan, for many Americans, remained more American than the Knights of Columbus.
Yes.
And that really shows, if you like, a major, should we say, flaw in whatever the American persona is. Right, is that for many Americans in the 1920s, not all that long ago, 100 years ago, the KKK was much more American than these Catholics.
And we have to remember too that the 20s is when the eugenics movement started going. All these racial theories about inferior races, and this was considered respectable opinions to consider these other races of people inferior to the white race. And yes, it was the 1920s. That wasn't long ago at all. when these were a respectable organization, the Ku Klux Klan and the Eugenics Society.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Joseph, you're in South Carolina. There's probably a chapter of Ku Klux Klan near you if you want to check in with them.
Well, there very probably is. In fact, very briefly, I'll tell you, when I first moved to this area, we were in a little small town called Lawrence, about 15 miles south from here. And there was something called the world famous Redneck Emporium, right? That's what it's called. And I thought, I'm a tourist. This was 2007 or so. I've only been in the country 5 years. And, I've got to check this out. What on earth is the world famous Redneck Emporium? We walked through the door. Leo was a little baby, about 3, and I'm with Susanna. Walked through the door, there's pictures of the Ku Klux Klan on the wall. There are neo-Nazi DVDs. And then what I always say about this, about the English, not wanting to be impolite. So Susanna took one look, did a U-turn, and walked out again with Leo, right? And there's me here. Why do I want to offend this fellow, right? I just walk out again. So I'm sort of making polite conversation with him, with the Ku Klux Klan pictures behind before making my polite excuses and then also leaving.
Good thing nobody took your
home to me, the sort of where we live.
Good thing nobody took your picture and put it on Facebook with this wonderful backdrop. But I would like to, before we call it a day here, to understand the role of urban politics with Irish Catholic Democrats and how this affects the Democratic Party to this very day. That I'm from Chicago, where we vote early and often, and seeing how the whole ward system worked in Chicago, and how much my WASP family just hated with a vehemence Democrats, Irish, because they saw these kinds of political machines being built in the urban centers of the country. And this guy explains beautifully on pages 320 to the end of this chapter how this whole thing came to be.
Yeah, Tammany Hall and its progeny. That's right.
And the interesting from historian Richard Hofstadter, describing the difference of these two political traditions, the sort of WASP political tradition, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and this new political tradition out of these immigrant poor of ethnic backgrounds, this sort of tribalism of it, right? That it was founded upon European backgrounds of the immigrants, their unfamiliarity with independent political action, their familiarity with hierarchy and authority, and upon the urgent needs that so often grew out of their migration, took for granted that the political life of the individual would arise out of family needs, interpreted political and civic relations chiefly in terms of personal obligations, and placed strong personal loyalties above allegiance to abstract codes of laws or morals. It was chiefly upon this system of values that the political life of the immigrant, the boss, and the urban machine was based.
Yeah, I think the very interesting here is this is a consequence of racism, a consequence of anti-Catholic prejudice, is he forced people into ghettos. If you force people into ghettos, they become tribal, right? Because they have to survive. And if the outside culture is hostile to them, they're going to club together and look after themselves. So, if the host culture doesn't like it, well, it's because they've actually caused it, right? Yeah. In excluding these people, they force them to get into ghettos, and then they come out of the ghetto organized and fighting.
And so the Democratic Party, growing out of this beginning, they just expanded the tribal groups that they were going to advocate for, including gays and what now trans, whatever. In other words, the way you continue this system of patronage by assuring these marginalized, persecuted groups that they're going to be, that their interests and needs will be met through the Democratic Party.
I don't want to finish the episode, this particular episode on a note of disagreement, but I think there's a big difference. So I think that the Democratic Party in its beginnings was an expression of the people. Now it's an intellectualized bourgeois elite.
I'm just explaining
who are imposing an ideology upon the people. It's a very different thing. Well, I think that all those early Democrats, that were basically part of this Irish flexing of their political muscles was a grassroots movement. What we have now is not a grassroots movement.
No, I wasn't saying it was a grassroots movement. I was saying that when your basis is to give to the aggrieved, whoever that is, you meet their needs and wants through government programs, and you now just keep adding groups of aggrieved people to your party. That's how your party grows. I'm saying that's how the Democratic Party has morphed to where it is today. I'm not saying that's good or laudable. I'm just saying that if your system of power is by giving to aggrieved groups the things that they need or want, notice how needs become wants or wants become needs, right? But that's how that power base got built and expanded to where it is now.
Except that the aggrieved groups now have all the power, they have all the money, that they are the plutocracy.
Yes.
So we're not talking about poor Irish immigrants in ghettos. We're talking about extremely wealthy people in Hollywood
who still are offering largesse to groups who, for whatever reason, feel aggrieved and feel that they deserve that. And
no, they're part of that group. They're part of that group. These people are part of that group.
Okay,
the plutocracy are part of that group. It's not about the underprivileged now demanding rights, right? It's about an elite trying to impose an agenda. It's a completely different thing.
It's also about groups at the bottom demanding things like Black Lives Matter. Okay, there is this ability for these elites at the top and these people demanding from the bottom, and they work together, and it's the people in the middle who get squeezed. Okay, and I'm just calling it the way I've seen it develop over the decades.
We're going to conclude, and I'm going to give myself the last word.
Good.
But we'll continue because this chapter was on walls, which separates us. Next chapter is on bridges, and we can resume even part of this conversation about what the Democratic Party has become. But I want to say this. You brought out the fact, Vivian, that the Knights of Columbus chose the name Columbus because that was unifying, a figure that could be respected by Protestants and Catholics.
Yes.
So that was unifying between Protestants and Catholics. But also the word knights was chosen because Father McGivney wanted to try and get rid of the inner Catholic tribalism and show that we all have to be gentlemen, chivalrous, courageous,
yes,
courteous. And so Knights of Columbus was unifying in two directions.
Yes.
Good. Well, ladies and gentlemen, and any others, children maybe, we'll be back on the next session to continue our discussion. Thank you very much. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at forumbookclub.ignatius.com.